A man found a dog buried alive, barely breathing. Broken and left to die, he could have walked away. But something in that dog's eyes made him stay what he did next. Not only saved the dog's life, it transformed his own in ways he never saw coming, because this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a bond that would rebuild a broken man, heal a wounded animal and bring a forgotten community back to life. But who buried? The dog, and why does helping one animal lead to the man confronting the past? Had tried so hard to bury. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned lot, painting stripes of gold between the wild grassy. Elliot moved carefully through the untamed space, his worn boots pressing silent footprints into the dewy ground. The air was still cool, carrying the fresh scent of earth and growing things that made these early hours worth the effort. He paused beside a cluster of purple lupins, their spiky blooms reaching toward the sky like nature's exclamation points, pulling his field journal from his canvas bag. Elliot opened it to a fresh page, the paper soft and wrinkled. Frumshue's his pencil moved with practiced precision as he sketched the flower shape, noting the date and location. In his neat small handwriting a few steps away, patches of milkweed pushed through the rocky soil. Their pink clusters seemed to glow in the morning light. Elliot smiled slightly, thinking of the monarch butterflies that would soon find their way here. He pulled on his gardening gloves and carefully collected a few specimens, placing them between the pages of his journal for later study. The sound of approaching footsteps made him tense. A jogger appeared on the cracked sidewalk that bordered the lot, their shoes slapping against the concrete in a steady rhythm. Elliot tugged the brim of his hat lower, turning his body away as they passed. He counted his breaths until the footsteps faded, his shoulders slowly relaxing. Assailants returned, moving deeper into the lot. Elliot approached the old factory fence. Rust had eaten through the chain links in places and wild vines claimed most of its surface. He was making notes about the native species when a sound caught his attention, a faint scratching barely audible above the morning breeze. Elliot froze, listening. There it was again, coming from behind the fence. He tucked his journal away and moved closer, peering through the gaps in the metal. At first he saw nothing unusual, just more weeds and debris. Then his eyes caught on something wrong, a mound of freshly disturbed earth. The dirt, darker and looser than its surroundings. The scratching sound came. Again weaker this time, his heart began to pound as he found a gap in the fence large enough to slip through. The mound was larger up close, and now he could see movement, slight, desperate shifts in the soil. Elliot dropped to his knees, ignoring the dirt that soaked through his jeans. He pulled off his gloves and began to dig with his bare hands. The earth was cool and damp against his fingers as he scraped it away. His breathing grew faster, matching the urgency of his movements. Then his hand touched something that wasn't dirt, something warm and soft fur working more carefully now. Elliot cleared away more soil until he uncovered a dog's face. The animal's eyes were barely open, glazed with pain and fear. Rope was wound tightly around its body, cutting into flesh in places, as Elliot continued to free it from the earth. His stomach turned where the dog's back right leg should have been. There was only scarred tissue, long-healed, easy. Elliot whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Easy. Now the dog didn't struggle as Elliot worked either, too weak or too resigned to fight once it was fully uncovered. Elliot could see it was male, probably a pit bull mix. His brown coat matted with dirt and blood. The rope told a story Elliot didn't want to read. Someone had done this deliberately, left this creature to die alone in the ground. Without hesitation, Elliot shrugged off his jacket. The morning air bit through his thin shirt, but he barely noticed as he carefully wrapped the dog in the warm fabric. The animal was lighter than he expected, too light, as he lifted him from the shallow grave. "I've got you," Elliot murmured, cradling the bundle close to his chest. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady against his arms as he made his way home, taking back alleys and side streets to avoid being seen. His kitchen looked different somehow when he entered, as if bringing the dog inside had altered the familiar space. Elliot cleared his cluttered table with one arm, sending papers and empty coffee mugs to the counter. He grabbed a clean towel from the laundry basket by the door and laid it out before gently setting the dog down. The rope had to come off first. Elliot found his scissors and began cutting carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones as he worked. "Almost done. You're doing great," Each piece of rope revealed new wounds, some fresh and others partially healed. The dog remained still throughout the process, watching Elliot with wary eyes. That held more awareness now. Once the rope was gone, Elliot retrieved his first aid kit from under the sink. It was well stocked, one of his few concessions. To preparedness, he cleaned each wound with antiseptic, his touches as gentle as possible. The dog flinched occasionally, but made no sound, no attempt to bite or escape. "You're tough, aren't you?" Elliot said softly, applying antibiotic ointment to the deeper cuts. "Been through a lot and still hanging on." When he finished, Elliot filled a bowl with fresh water and placed it within easy reach of the dog's head. The animal's gaze followed his movements but made no attempt to drink. Yet that was okay. There would be time. Elliot looked at the dog, thoughtfully taking in his scarred face and missing leg, the quiet dignity in his pose despite everything. "Root," he said suddenly, the name rising from some deep place in his mind. It fit somehow, like the hidden strength of plants pushing through concrete, surviving against all odds. Finding an old cardboard box, Elliot lined it with his softest blankets, creating a makeshift bed with infinite care. He lifted Root and placed him in the nest of fabric. The dog settled immediately, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Elliot pulled a kitchen chair close to the box and sat down. Root's breathing had grown deeper, more regular as he drifted into sleep. Elliot watched the gentle rise and fall of his chest, feeling equally exhausted and unsure of what the next step should be. But for now, this was enough. Root was safe, and they would figure out the rest together. The morning light crept through Elliot's dusty windows, casting pale shadows across the kitchen floor. His neck ached from sleeping at an awkward angle, his body stiff from spending the night on the hardwood beside Root's box. He hadn't meant to fall asleep there, but sometime during his vigil exhaustion had won out. Elliot blinked and pushed himself up to sitting, his joints protesting them. Oovement Root was awake, dark eyes barely open, but tracking Elliot's every motion. The dog's breathing seemed steadier than yesterday, though his body still trembled slightly with each inhale. "Morning," Elliot said softly. His voice rough with sleep. Root's ears twitched at the sound, but he made neither movement. The gentle patter of rain against the windows filled the quiet kitchen. Elliot stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. His mind turned to food. Root needed to eat something, but regular dog food might be too much for his weakened system in his pantry. Elliot found a loaf of bread and some chicken broth he'd made last week. He tore the bread into tiny pieces, dropping them into a shallow bowl. The broth sizzled quietly in the microwave as he heated it, and soon the kitchen filled with its warm, savoury smell. When the broth was ready, Elliot poured it over the bread pieces, letting them soak until they were soft and easily digestible. He knelt beside Root's box, holding the bowl close enough for the dog to smell, but not so near as to seem threatening. "Think you can manage some breakfast?" he asked. Quietly, Root lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. His whole body trembled with the effort, but he stretched his neck toward the bowl. Elliot held it steady as Root took his first tentative bite, then another. The dog ate, slowly, carefully, as if expecting the food to be snatched away at any moment. When Root had eaten about half the mixture, he laid his head back down, exhausted by even this small effort. Elliot set the bowl aside and sat back against the kitchen cabinets, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. He needed to learn more about caring for an injured dog. His knowledge of first aid only went so far. His old laptop sat gathering dust on a shelf. Elliot retrieved it, brushing off the layer of grime before opening it. The machine wheezed to life, fan whirring as if complaining about being disturbed while it loaded. Elliot made himself a cup of coffee, the familiar routine helping to settle his nerves for the next hour. He researched basic animal caretaking, notes in his field journal. The information was overwhelming: proper nutrition, wound care, rehabilitation, exercises. Root would need proper dog food, more medical supplies, something to keep him occupied during recovery. The local feed store wasn't far. He could walk there and back before the rain got worse. "I'll be back soon," he told Root, who watched him pull on his jacket with those same steady eyes. The feed store's bell jingled as Elliot pushed open the door, sending a spike of anxiety through his chest. He kept his head down, moving quickly through the aisles. Dog food. For sensitive stomachs, fresh bandages, a soft rubber chew toy that wouldn't hurt Root's teeth. He piled everything on the counter, wishing he could just leave the money and go, "New dog?" The clerk asked cheerfully. Scanning the items, Elliot nodded stiffly, fishing out his wallet. "What breed?" "We've got some great supplements for just this, thanks." Ellie cut her off immediately, regretting his harsh tone. The clerk's smile faltered. But she finished ringing up his purchases in silence. The rain had picked up by the time he left the store, but Elliot barely noticed it, soaking through his jacket. His mind was already back home with Root wondering. If the dog was okay, alone, he walked, fast to plastic bags swinging at his sides back in his house. Elliot found Root exactly as he'd left him, though the dog's tail thumped once against the blankets when he entered a tiny gesture that made something warm bloom in Elliot's chest after. Putting away the supplies, Elliot turned his attention to the living room. The space was cluttered with books and papers, old plant specimens he'd collected over the years. He began clearing it out, creating a path from Root's box to a sunny spot near. The window-old rugs came out of the hall closet. Their patterns faded, but the fabric still soft. He laid them down, carefully overlapping the edges to create a continuous surface for when you're ready to move around. He explained to Root, who had been watching. The whole process with interest, no pressure. Though the day passed quietly, Elliot sat with his field journal sketching the plants he'd collected yesterday morning. Was it really just yesterday? It felt like weeks had passed since he'd found Root. The rain continued falling, creating a peaceful backdrop to their shared silence as evening approached. Root began shifting in his box, his muscles tensing with purpose. Elliot set aside his journal, watching as the dog braced his front legs against the blankets with tremendous effort. Root pushed himself up his single back leg, trembling with the strain for a moment. He stood swaying slightly, but upright. Elliot held his breath, not daring to move. Then Root's strength gave out, and he collapsed back into the box, with a soft whimper, the first sound Elliot had heard him make. Hey, that was amazing," Elliot said, kneeling beside the box. "You're doing so well, rest now, try again when you're ready." He reached out slowly, giving Root plenty of time to pull away if he wanted to, but instead of shrinking back, Root lifted his head and pressed his nose against Elliot's palm. The touch was gentle, deliberate, a moment of trust that made Elliot's throat tight with emotion. Later, Elliot made a simple dinner of soup and crackers. Instead of eating at the table, he settled on the floor next to Root's box. The bowl balanced on his knee. They sat together in comfortable silence. The only sounds, the clink of Elliot's spoon and the distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the east. 2 weeks had passed, bringing with them small but steady changes. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elliot's back steps as he carried out 2 plates, one with toast and eggs for himself, and another with Root's specially formulated breakfast. The ritual had developed naturally over the past few days, neither of them discussing it, but both seeming to find comfort in the routine. Root moved carefully but confidently, on his 3 legs, now having mastered a unique gait that allowed him to navigate the steps and yard with growing ease. His wounds had begun to heal, leaving patches of new pink skin visible through his slowly returning. Further fear in his eyes had faded too, replaced by an alert curiosity about his surroundings. Elliot settled onto the top step, placing Root's bowl nearby. The dog lowered himself gracefully onto the wooden planks, his movements showing none of the trembling uncertainty from 2 weeks ago. They ate in companionable silence. The morning air crisp and clean around them. Above them, sparrows darted between the branches of an old maple tree, their wings catching the early light. Root watched them intently, his head tilting at their chirps and calls. His tail would occasionally thump against the step, betraying his interest in their acrobatic displays. Elliot balanced his plate on his knee and pulled out his worn field journal. The pages were filled with his precise handwriting and detailed sketches. But today, he turned to a fresh page. His pencil moved across the paper in sure strokes as he began mapping out the neglected backyard, noting sunny spots and shaded areas, marking the best places for new beds and paths. The yard had become a jungle of overgrowth during his years of self-imposed isolation. Brambles twisted through forgotten garden tools and weeds pushed up through the cracked remains of old planting beds. But as Elliot sketched, he began to see the potential hidden beneath the chaos. After breakfast, Elliot changed into work clothes and gathered some basic tools. Root followed him into the yard, watching with interest as Elliot began pulling rusted rakes and broken shovels from the tangles of vegetation. Each tool brought back memories of his former life, the precise lines of urban gardens, the satisfaction of creating green spaces in concrete deserts. He set the memories aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The morning passed. In steady work, Elliot cut back brambles, cleared pathways, and discovered remnants of his old gardens beneath the wilderness. In a weathered storage bin protected from the elements, he found packets of seeds from his landscaping days, native flowers, and hearty perennials that might still be viable. Root moved from spot to spot. As Elliot worked, never straying too far, he would settle in patches of sunlight, observing Elliot's progress with steady eyes. Sometimes he would investigate an interesting smell or sound, but he always returned to keep watch over Elliot's activities. As the afternoon sun began to slope westward, Elliot took a break from clearing to build a small pen near the back steps. He used some old fencing panels and posts he'd uncovered, creating a secure space where Root could rest outdoors without risking his still-healing injuries. The pen wasn't large, but it offered a safe vantage point from which Root could survey the yard and enjoy the fresh air. Root inspected the pen thoroughly when Elliot finished sniffing each corner and testing the gate with his nose, seeming satisfied. He settled onto the soft blanket Elliot had placed inside his posture, relaxed, but alert. The day's final task was trimming back the branches of an old tree that had grown too close to the house. Elliot worked methodically, the rhythmic snip of the pruning shears joining the evening chorus of birds and insects. Root dozed in his pen, occasionally opening his eyes to check on Elliot's progress. The sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful scene. Elliot froze, pruning shears still raised. Root's head snapped up a low growl rumbling in his chest. The first aggressive sound Elliot had heard from him. More laughter drifted from the front of the house, young voices trying to sound tough but betraying their nervousness. Setting down his tools, Elliot moved quietly toward the front yard. Root's growl followed him, a steady, warning sound that spoke of protective instinct rather than fear. As Elliot rounded the corner of the house, he caught sight of 3 figures running away in the growing dusk, their silhouettes blending into the shadows between streetlights. The damage was immediately visible. Fresh paint dripped down his front fence in garish streaks, and pieces of a broken flower pot lay scattered across the front path. The pot had been one of his few remaining pieces from his landscaping days, its glazed surface now shattered beyond repair. Elliot stood very still, looking at the mess in the past. This kind of vandalism would have driven him deeper into isolation, reinforcing his walls against the outside world. But something felt different now. Perhaps it was Root's steady presence at his back, or the productive work of the day still humming in his muscles. Without a word, Elliot went to his garage and found an old bucket and some rags. He filled the bucket with warm water and soap, then knelt beside the fence. The paint was still wet enough to clean if he worked quickly. Root had followed him, and now sat nearby, alert, but no longer growling, watching as Elliot began to scrub away the evidence of the teens' brief invasion of their space. The next morning brought crisp air, clearing yesterday's tension. Elliot sat cross-legged on his steps, examining the broken flower pot pieces on newspaper. Root lounged nearby in sunlight, watching. The pot had split cleanly enough that Elliot might salvage it. He arranged the pieces like a puzzle, matching the glazed patterns before applying waterproof adhesive. Root's ear occasionally perked at passing cars, but he remained calm. His once constant, fearful trembling had given way to quiet alertness when the pot was reassembled. Elliot left it to dry and stretched, with Root following. They walked the property perimeter. Morning dew revealed where teens had climbed the fence near trampled grass. Elliot found a dropped pocket knife with NR scratched into its handle. Root sniffed it. Without hostility, not much point in getting worked up about it, Elliot murmured, pocketing the knife. They spent hours working in the yard, Elliot preparing garden beds while Root supervised from shade. As afternoon waned, young voices approached. 3 teenagers appeared, 2 boys, and a girl 14 or 15 years old. The tall, dark-haired leader called out, "Hey, old man, nice paint job on your fence. Want us to add another coat?" Elliot continued working silently as the tall boy prepared to climb over. Elliot simply opened the gate wide, stunning them. "You want to break something, you'll fix it first," he said quietly. "Show up tomorrow with gloves." "Yeah," And why should we? The leader challenged. Elliot displayed the pocket knife. Because this belongs to you and breaking things is easy. Fixing them takes skill. He set the knife on a fence post and returned to work, leaving the gate open. The teens eventually left, though the girl lingered, eyeing the garden with interest. That evening, Elliot arranged supplies on his porch, 3 sets of work gloves, tells, and gardening tools, a silent statement of expectation root pressed against his legs. They sat in growing darkness. "We'll see if they come," Elliot muttered, as wind chimes played softly in the breeze. The next morning dawned clear and warm, with sunlight filtering through the scattered clouds. Elliot had been up since dawn, preparing the yard and checking his tools. Root lay on the porch, his head resting on his front paw, watching Elliot's methodical movements with steady eyes. It was nearly 10. When the teens finally appeared at the gate, they shuffled in awkwardly, Nico in front with his hands shoved deep in his pockets and a scowl etched across his face. Maya followed, her eyes darting around the yard with poorly concealed interest. A sketchbook clutched to her chest. Wes brought up the rear, silent Asselways, his glasses catching the morning light as he took in every detail of the property. Elliot didn't waste time with greetings or small talk. He simply walked over to where he'd laid out the work gloves and handed a pair to each teen. The gloves were old but sturdy, the kind he used back in his landscaping days. He gestured toward the overgrown garden beds that lined the eastern fence, thick with weeds and years of neglect. From his spot on the porch, Root's ears perked up as he watched the newcomers. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes never left the group, especially Nico, whose nervous energy seemed to draw the dog's attention. "Start there," Elliot said, pointing to the worst section. "Pull everything that isn't flowering. Leave the roots intact when you can." His voice was firm but neutral, carrying neither warmth nor criticism. The teen stood awkwardly for a moment before Maya broke away. First finding a spot near a partially cleared bed, instead of reaching for the weeds, though. She settled cross-legged in the grass and opened her sketchbook. Her pencil moved quickly across the page as she began capturing the layout of the garden. Nico made a show of sighing dramatically before yanking at the nearest weed cluster. "This is stupid," he muttered, though loud enough for everyone to hear. "We could be anywhere else right now." Despite his complaints, his hands kept moving, pulling weed after weed. His technique was rough but effective, and Elliot noticed how naturally the boy's hands worked with the earth, even if his mouth said otherwise. We had drifted toward the fence line where broken glass still glittered in the morning light. Without being asked, He began carefully collecting the shards, methodically working his way along the perimeter. His movements were precise and thoughtful, marking each cleaned area with small piles of stones to ensure he didn't miss any spots. Elliot moved between them, demonstrating proper techniques without making a show of it. He showed Nico how to grip closer to the base of the weeds, reducing the chance of leaving roots behind. He placed a bucket near Wes for the glass and pointed out where to find work, gloves better suited for handling sharp objects. When he passed, Maya paused to look at her sketch but said nothing. Simply nodding before moving on, Root began to venture from his porch position. Making slow circuits of the yard, he kept his distance from the teens, but drew gradually closer with each pass. His body language remained calm, showing none of the tension that usually accompanied new people in his space. "You're doing it wrong," Nico announced after watching Elliot demonstrate a particular pulling technique. "It's faster if you just yank them out." "Faster isn't always better," Elliot replied evenly, continuing his methodical work. "Sometimes you have to slow down to do things." "Right." The morning wore on, punctuated by Nico's running commentary about the heat, the dirt, and the pointlessness of gardening. Yet beneath his complaints, Elliot could see the boy's natural strength and capability in the growing pile of weeds beside him. Maya's sketch had evolved into a detailed rendering of the garden's layout, complete with notes about light patterns and existing plant placements. He occasionally looked up to study specific areas more closely, her face showing concentrated focus. Rather than the defensive attitude she'd arrived with, Wes worked in complete silence. But his progress was steady and thorough. He'd cleared nearly all the glass from the fence line and had begun organizing the collected shards by color and size, creating a systematic approach to what could have been a chaotic task. As Thiessen climbed higher, root circuits brought him increasingly closer to the working teens he paid special attention to. Maya, perhaps sensing her quieter energy when she shifted positions. To get a better view for her sketch, he didn't retreat as quickly as before. Around midday, Elliot disappeared into the house and returned, with a tray holding water glasses and simple sandwiches, cheese and tomato on whole wheat bread. He set the tray on the porch steps without ceremony. "Take a break," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. The teens gathered uncertainly at the porch, each taking a sandwich and glass of water before settling on the steps. The silence that fell was awkward, but not entirely uncomfortable. They, without talking, the only sounds being the rustle of wax paper and the distant call of birds' root lay nearby close. Enough to observe, but maintaining his careful distance. His eyes moved between the teens and Elliot, reading the group's dynamic with that uncanny awareness that had marked him from the beginning as they finished eating. Maya brushed the crumbs from her hands and slowly extended one toward Root. The dog watched her carefully but didn't move, a way the others pretended not to notice this interaction, though Elliot saw Nicker watching from the corner of his eye when the teens finally gathered there. Things to leave their earlier bravado had been replaced by a kind of tired satisfaction that comes from physical work. They headed toward the gate, but Maya suddenly turned back, moving with careful deliberation toward Root. The dog remained still as she approached, his eyes alert but calm when she reached out to touch his head. He didn't flinch or pull away. Her hand gently stroked his fur once-twice before she hurried to catch up with the others. Elliot observed this moment without comment, his face revealing nothing. But later that evening, as the sun was setting and Root dozed nearby, He pulled out his field journal for the first time in months. The leather was cracked, the pages dusty from disuse. He opened to a fresh page and began to write, documenting the day's events with the same careful attention he'd once given to cataloguing plants and planting gardens. His pen moved steadily across the paper, recording not just what had happened, but what he had observed Nico's natural strength. Despite his resistance, Maya's artistic eye and gentle approach, Wes's methodical problem-solving and Root's gradual acceptance of these unexpected visitors, the journal entry marked more than just the day's activities. It was the first step in recording a new kind of growth in his garden. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elliot's garden as he stepped outside, Root limping faithfully by his side. He didn't need to check his watch to know the kids would arrive soon. They'd fallen into an unspoken routine over the past week, showing up just after breakfast without being asked or prompted. Sure enough, Maya appeared first, her sketchbook tucked under one arm and a box of coloured pencils in her other hand. She gave a small wave as she approached, and Root trotted over to greet her. His tail wagging gently, the change in the dog's demeanour was striking. Where once he'd kept his distance, now he actively sought out the teen's attention. Wes arrived next, carrying a backpack that linked. With tools he'd brought from home, he gave his usual quiet nod to Elliot and immediately headed toward the half-finished irrigation system they'd been working on. His fingers moved deftly over the connections, checking yesterday's work before starting. On the new section, Nico showed up, last hand stuffed in his pockets, and hood pulled up despite the warming day. He tried to slip in without drawing attention, but Root noticed him and patted over, pressing against his leg, until Nico reached down to scratch behind his ears. Elliot gathered them near the tool shed, where Maya's detailed sketches of the garden layout now decorated the weathered walls. The papers fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, held in place by rusty thumbtacks. Each drawing showed a different section of the garden, some, as it was now others, depicting what it could become. Nico, Elliot said, pointing to a pile of grass clippings and kitchen scraps. The compost needs turning layer. It with the dry leaves from yesterday. He demonstrated the proper technique, showing how to mix the materials for optimal decomposition. Nico wrinkled his nose at the task, but moved toward the pile without complaint. His strong arms made quick work of the heavy materials, and despite his initial disgust, he soon became absorbed in creating the perfect balance of green and brown matter. Maya Elliot continued those raised beds. Need marking out use your sketches as a guide? He handed her some wooden stakes and twine. She nodded eagerly already, pulling out her measuring tape and consulting her drawings. Wes Elliot turned to the quiet boy who was already examining the irrigation supplies. We'll finish the drip line for the tomato section today. Wes gave a small smile, clearly pleased to continue with the technical work he excelled at as the morning progressed. The garden's transformation became more evident with each passing hour. Where tangles of weeds had once dominated neat paths, now emerged. The raised beds took shape under Maya's careful guidance. Each one, perfectly aligned according to her plans. Root moved between the working groups, spending time with each teen, as if performing his own kind of supervision. He seemed particularly attentive to Nico, who had shed his hoodie in the growing heat, revealing a dark bruise on his upper arm. When Elliot noticed, he said nothing, but made a point of working closer to the boys' section near the old bench, which Maya had convinced everyone to paint a cheerful blue last weekend. Competitive chatter broke out over. "The tomato plant's mine's already got 3 flowers," Nico called out, pointing to his section of the bed. "Yeah, but yours are all bunched together," Mia replied, sketching as she spoke. "They need more space to grow properly." Wes didn't join the debate verbally, but he adjusted the drip line to ensure his plants would receive optimal water distribution. A small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as they worked. Their usual defences began to lower as they had been doing more and more. Lately, Maya sat cross-legged near her newly marked beds, absently pulling weeds while talking about her mother's long work hours. "She tries to make it to my art shows," she said, adding detail to a sketch of the finished garden. "But sometimes she's just too tired." Wes, typically silent, started humming, quietly. While he worked on the irrigation system, the simple tune carried across the garden, mixing with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Though he never spoke about it, his growing comfort in the space was evident in these small expressions. Nico remained, focused on the compost, his movements becoming almost mechanical as he worked. When he thought no one was watching, he would adjust his sleeve to cover the bruise on his arm. His face tight with emotion. He clearly didn't want to share the day wound. Down as the sun began to set, casting orange light across the newly organised space, the teens packed up their tools and headed home. Their departures as unstructured as their arrivals had been. Maya left her latest sketch pinned to the shed wall, a detailed plan for an herb garden near the back fence as darkness settled over the garden. Elliot did his usual evening walk through, checking the day's progress route, followed along his 3-legged gait, steady on the newly cleared paths when they reached Maya's blue bench. Elliot found Root's favourite spot underneath it, where the dog had worn a comfortable hollow in the soil there. Next to the depression, where Root liked to sleep, sat an unopened granola bar. Elliot recognised it as the same kind Nico usually ate during their water breaks. The wrapper was slightly crushed, as if it had been carried in a pocket for a while before being carefully placed there. A small smile crossed Elliot's face as he observed this silent offering he reached for his field journal, which had become a constant companion again over the past week. Finding a clean page, he began to sketch Root as the dog curled up in his spot under the bench, the granola bar quiet testament to how much had changed in such a short time. The garden was quiet except for the soft scratching of Elliot's pencil and Root's contented sighs. As he settled into sleep, the blue bench gleamed softly in the fading light. Mia's artistic touch, evident in the careful brushstrokes nearby. Wes's irrigation system dripped steadily, nurturing the tomato plants that had sparked such friendly competition, and in the corner Nico's carefully tended compost pile waited for tomorrow's additions. The evening settled over the garden like a soft blanket, bringing with it the gentle chirping of crickets and the faint rustling of leaves. The single porch bulb cast a warm yellow glow over the worn wooden steps, creating long shadows that stretched across the newly tended garden beds. Most of the teens had headed home after their usual work session, but Nico remained sitting on the bottom step with his shoulders hunched. Elliot noticed the boy's reluctance to leave as he was closing up the tool shed Root had already taken, his usual spot near the porch, his 3-legged form relaxed but alert dark eyes watching the quiet scene before him. The town around them had grown still, with only occasional distant car sounds breaking through the evening peace. The boy's posture spoke volumes, the way he kept checking his phone, then putting it away, the nervous tapping of his foot against the wooden step. Elliot had seen this behaviour before in his years of working with community gardens, recognised the silent plea for delay for a reason to stay just a little longer instead of asking questions. Elliot simply opened his screen door and went inside through the window. He could see Nico's shoulders slumped slightly, probably thinking he was being dismissed. But moments later, Elliot returned, with 2 bowls of leftover vegetable soup he'd made the day before. Steam rising in the cool evening air, he handed one bowl to Nico without ceremony, and sat down on the step beside him, leaving enough space between them to avoid. Making the boy uncomfortable, Root shifted his position to keep both humans in view. His tail making soft thumping sounds against the wooden deck they ate in silence for a while, the only sounds being the quiet clink of spoons against bowls and the distant hoot of an early evening owl. The soup's warmth seemed to help Nico relax slightly. His tight shoulders gradually loosening, Ash ate the garden spread out before them, transformed from its earlier wild state. Maya's raised beds stood in neat, rose their edges crisp against the darkening soil. Weese's irrigation system gleamed dully in the porch light, and the compost pile Nico had so carefully tended sat in its corner, properly layered and beginning to break down. Root had dozed off, his breathing steady and calm, a far cry from the trembling, terrified creature Elliot had found buried in the ground. The dog's missing leg was less noticeable now that he'd learned to balance himself, though the scars remained visible through his slowly regrowing fur. Nico set his empty bowl aside and pulled his knees up to his chest. Making himself smaller on the step, his fingers played with a loose thread on his jeans, twisting it around and around, as if gathering courage. The porch light caught the fading bruisin, his arm now a yellowish green instead of the dark purple it had been days. Nico started, then stopped, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept his eyes fixed on his shoes, refusing to look up. I think I know where your dog came from. Elliot remained still, careful not to interrupt the moment with any sudden movements he'd learned over the years, that silence could be more encouraging than words. My cousin, Nico continued, his voice getting lower. He has this place behind his house. His fingers had moved from the thread to picking at a splinter in the wooden step. There's these cages there and ropes, and he swallowed hard. They make them fight. Root stirred in his sleep, letting out a small whimper that seemed to pierce the quiet evening. Nico flinched at the sound, his shoulders drawing up again. There's this arena thing, I guess you'd call it, in the backyard. The words came faster now, tumbling out, as if Nico couldn't hold them back anymore. They tie ropes around them to train them. Make them mean Theonies that lose. He didn't finish the sentence, but his glance toward Root's missing legs, enough Elliot's. Jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral. His hand steady. On his empty soup bowl, the single porch bulb cast enough light to show the shame and anger roaring on Nico's face as he spoke. I used to go there sometimes when things were bad at home. Nico admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Never watched the fights, but I'd hear them, the dogs, they'd make these sounds. He pressed his palms against his eyes as if trying to block out them. Emery Root shifted in his sleep again, his leg twitching as he dreamed them. Movement drew both their attention, and Nico finally looked up at the dog. His eyes glistening in the porch light when I saw him that first day here. Nico gestured toward Root. I recognized the rope marks. They're the same ones my cousiness's. He pulled his sleeves down over his hands, bunching the fabric in his fists. Should have done something before, should have told someone. But Elliot sat perfectly still. Absorbing every word, his expression remained calm. But anyone looking closely might have noticed the slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped his bowl, the careful, measured pace of his breathing. Nico reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, holding it out without looking at it. This is the address, he said, his voice barely audible. I wrote it down earlier, I thought maybe. Elliot took the paper without a word, folding it carefully and sliding it into his shirt pocket. Root had woken up and moved closer. Pressing his warm body against Nico's leg in a gesture of comfort that made the boy's breath catch, they sat there. For a while longer, the three of them, as the evening deepened around them and the crickets grew louder. Eventually Nico's phone buzzed and he stood up reluctantly, wiping his eyes with his sleeve after Nico had disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch light. Elliot went inside. He moved through his quiet house to his desk, where he pulled out the crumpled paper and carefully copied the address onto a sticky note. The drawers lock clicked softly as he secured the note inside, the sound seeming to echo in the silent room. Root had followed him in, and now lay at his feet. His scarred body, relaxed but his eyes alert. Watching Elliot's every move, Elliot knelt beside him, running his hands gently through the dog's fur, feeling the raised lines of healed wounds beneath his fingers. We'll take care of it, he whispered. his eyes heavy with thought as he continued to pet Root the locked drawer, holding its secret behind him. The morning air held a crisp edge as Elliot walked down Main Street. His steps measured and purposeful, the sealed manila envelope felt heavy in his jacket pocket, weighted. Not just with paper, but with the gravity of what it contained. He'd written everything down carefully, the address, Nico's descriptions of the cages and ropes, the makeshift arena, all of it, detailed in clear, impersonal language. The anonymous tip box stood bolted to the wall outside the police station, its blue metal surface weathered but sturdy. Elliot had passed it countless times before without a second glance, no. He stood before it, checking the street in both directions before pulling out the envelope. No name on the front nor turn address, just the facts inside typed on plain white paper. He slipped the envelope through the slot. Hearing it land with a soft thud, among whatever other secrets lay within for a moment, he kept his hand on the box, feeling its cool surface beneath his palm. Then he turned and walked away, leaving no trace of his presence behind. The walk home took him past familiar storefronts just beginning to open for the day, the bakery's morning scent wafted out, and the newsstand owner nodded as he arranged his papers. Elliot kept his pace steady, his hat pulled low, focusing on the rhythm of his boots against the sidewalk. When he reached his house, he could already hear activity in the backyard. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, revealing Maya kneeling by her flower beds. Pencil moving quickly across her sketchbook, Wes sat cross-legged near the fence, examining the hinges with careful attention. Root lay in his usual spot, under the bench, his head raised to watch Elliot's arrival. The morning progressed quietly, with Elliot moving between tasks with less conversation than usual. He helped Wes gather tools to reinforce the gate-holding board steady as the boy worked out measurements in his head. The new hinges they'd bought gleamed silver against the old wood Maya approached with her sketchbook. Holding it out for approval, her latest design showed curved paths weaving between the flower beds with detailed notes about which plants would go where. Elliot studied it carefully, pointing out a few spots where the spacing could be. Adjusted, Maya beamed at his suggestions, immediately sitting down to make the changes. The sun climbed higher, warming the garden as they worked. Nico arrived, midam. Morning slipping in through the gate without his usual dramatic entrance, his eyes met Elliot's briefly, before sliding away. But he picked up a rake and started clearing space for Maya's new paths, without being asked. Root moved between them all, his three-legged gait now smooth and confident as he investigated their progress. He lingered near Nico more than usual, occasionally pressing against the boy's leg when he paused in his work, if anyone noticed the extra attention. They didn't mention it as afternoon settled. In the atmosphere in the garden gradually lightened. Maya started humming as she marked out her paths with string, and Wes allowed himself a small smile when the gate swung smoothly on its new hinges. Even Nico's shoulders began to relax. Ash worked. The first laugh came unexpectedly. Maya had accidentally sprayed herself with the hose while watering the tomatoes. The sound seemed to startle everyone, including her, but then Nico snorted at her surprised expression. Soon Wes was grinning too, and even Elliot felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. After that, the laughter came easier. They found humour in Root's determined attempt to dig up one of Mars marking stakes in Wes's careful calculations, being interrupted by a weeward butterfly in the way Nico jumped. When a sprinkler suddenly came on, the garden seemed to absorb the sounds, the plants swaying gently in the breeze, as if enjoying the change in mood. They worked until the sun began to set the golden light, making the garden glow. Maya's paths had taken shape, marked out with string and stakes. Wes's gate stood solid and true. Nico's cleared spaces waited ready for whatever would come next. As the kids gathered their things to leave, the laughter lingered in the air like the day's warmth. Trapped between the flowers that night, Elliot sat on his back porch, Root beside him, both watching the distant horizon. The first flash of red and blue lights appeared just after midnight, reflecting off the low clouds hanging over the condemned area. Root's ears perked up at the faint sound of sirens, but he remained calm, pressing closer to Elliot's leg. They stayed there together, watching the lights dance in the distance until the night grew quiet again. Elliot's hand rested on Root's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The strong heartbeat beneath, the scarred skin neither moved until the first hint of dawn began to lighten. Thesky morning brought whispers through the town like wind through leaves. Elliot heard Fragments as he picked up supplies at the hardware store. Multiple arrests. Animal cruelty charges. Evidence seized. The clerk mentioned something about dogs being rescued, but Elliot just nodded and paid for his purchases. The kids arrived at their usual times, except for Nico Meyer worked on transplanting seedlings, while West incurred with the irrigation system. The morning stretched on the sun, climbing higher route, making his rounds between the flower beds, when Nico finally appeared nearly 2 hours. Late, his face was tight with anxiety. He stood just inside the gate, hands shoved deep in his pockets, eyes darting between Elliot and the ground. The morning news hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy as summer storm clouds. Elliot looked, up from where he was checking Maya's seedlings. His face remained neutral as he met Nico's gaze. Then he simply nodded toward the shovel leaning against the fence. "You're late," he said, his voice carrying no judgment, just the simple statement of fact. Nico stood frozen for a moment, longer than his chest fell in a long exhale, his shoulders dropping, as if releasing a weight he'd carried up the street. He crossed the garden, picked up the shovel and joined Ma at the flower bed's root. Trailing quietly behind him, the morning mail arrived with its usual quiet shuffle through the slot. Elliot gathered the few envelopes from the floor, sorting through bills and advertisements. With mechanical precision, his hands paused at a plain white envelope with no return address. Just his name and address typed in clean professional font inside, he found a single newspaper clipping folded precisely into thirds. The paper had yellowed, slightly with age, but the black headline remained stark and clear. Urban Vision crumbles, whistleblower silent. His name appeared in the first paragraph, mentioned as the lead landscaper who had resigned following the project's collapse. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each one carrying the weight of memories he'd worked hard. To bury Elliot set the clipping on his kitchen table next to his morning coffee that had long since gone cold. Root lay in his usual spot by the back door, watching with alert eyes as Elliot paced the small kitchen outside. He could hear Maya and Wes already at work in the garden, their voices drifting through the screen door like distant music. The morning passed slowly, with Elliot moving through his usual routines while the clipping sat untouched on the table. He helped Maya transplant her latest batch of seedlings, checked Wes's progress on the irrigation system, and showed Nico how to properly stake the growing tomato plant's root, followed him from task to task, staying closer than usual, as if sensing something wasn't quite right. The sound of the garden gate creaking open in the early afternoon drew everyone's attention. A woman stood there professionally, dressed but comfortable in the summer heat. Her notebook and press badge identified her before she spoke. Danica Lear, journalist. She smiled warmly, but her eyes held the sharp focus of someone used to finding stories in small details. "Mr. Harrison," she called out, her voice carrying across the garden. "I'm Danica Lear. I was hoping we could talk about the Urban Vision project." Elliot straightened from where he'd been helping Maya with her flowers, his face settling into careful neutrality. Groot pressed against his league, a steady presence as Danica approached. "I'm working on a retrospective piece," she continued, maintaining a respectful distance about what really happened with the project collapse. She paused, her voice softening, "about how you took the fall for James Morton. The kids had stopped working there." Attention caught by the shift in atmosphere. Maya's hands stilled over her seedlings, her eyes moving between Elliot and the journalist. Wes sat down his tools, and Nico moved closer, pretending to check the tomato stakes while clearly listening. "There's nothing to discuss," Elliot said, his voice quiet but firm. "That story is long finished." Danica didn't move, her professional smile. "Unchanged, is it because I've spent months reviewing the original documentation, the structural issues? Morton ignored the corners he cut all, while you tried to raise concerns through proper channels." She took a small step forward. "You protected him by resigning. But he's retired now. The truth can't hurt him anymore." Elliot turned away, focusing on straightening Mia's row of plants. Root growled softly, picking up on his tension. The journalist waited a moment longer before placing her card on the garden bench. "Think about it," she said gently. "Sometimes old stories need new endings." She turned and left the gate clicking shut behind her. The garden fell into uncomfortable silence. The kids tried to return to their task, but the rhythm had been broken. Maya moved closer, to where Elliot still knelt by her flower bed, her fingers nervously twisting a piece of garden twine. "Is that why you left the city?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's hands stilled in the dirt. The question hung in the warm afternoon air, heavy with unspoken history. Root shifted closer, pressing his nose against Elliot's arm after a long moment. Elliot stood and walked into the house without answering, leaving the kids to exchange worried glances. The day faded into evening, the garden settling into long shadows. The kids had gone home, except for Nico, lingered by the tool shed watching, as Elliot sat alone on the garden bench. The newspaper clipping lay in his hands. The edges worn from being folded and unfolded throughout the day. A metal barrel stood nearby, usually used for burning. Garden waste. Elliot struck a match, holding it until the flame nearly reached his fingers. Then he touched it to the corner of the article, watching as the fire slowly consumed the yellowed paper. The headline disappeared first, then his name, until all that remained were ashes falling into the barrel. Nico stepped out from the shadows, his footsteps quiet on the garden path. He stopped a few feet from the bench, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Root looked up from his spot at Elliot's feet, but didn't move. "You ever think about going back?" Nico asked, his voice carrying the genuine curiosity of youth. Elliot watched the last ember fade in the barrel. Sometimes, he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. But not for long. A week passed, like water through soil, each day marked by the steady rhythm of garden work and quiet conversations. The morning sun had just cleared the eastern fence when Danica Laird's familiar figure appeared at the garden gate. This time she carried no notebook, no press badge, just a folded newspaper and what looked like a business card. Elliot was checking the tomato supports when he spotted her. Root, who'd been dozing in a patch of morning sunlight, lifted his head and watched her approach with mild interest. Rather than his usual weariness, the kids hadn't arrived yet. The garden was still in its peaceful morning state, dew clinging to leaves and spiderwebs glenning between branches. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Danica called out, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Elliot pause. She didn't wait for an invitation, walking purposefully down the stone path Maya had helped design. "I thought you should see this first." She held out the newspaper, folded to show an article that took up most of the page. The headline read, "Urban Vision Collapse, the Truth Emerges." Elliot's hands remained at his side's dirt, still clinging to his gardening gloves. "I published the full story." Danica continued, undeterred by his silence. Every document, every suppressed report, every detail about how James Morton ignored the structural warnings. She set the paper on a nearby bench. "Your name is clear. Mr. Harrison, the truth is finally out." Elliot's expression remained carefully neutral, but his shoulders carried a tension that Root noticed, causing the dog to move closer to his side. Danica reached into her jacket pocket and produced a business card, holding it out like an offering. "There's more," she said, her voice softening. "An architecture firm in the city, Green and Associates. They've been following the story. They're launching a new green community project, something that would transform abandoned lots into sustainable living spaces." She paused, watching Elliot's face. "They want you as a consultant. Your expertise in native landscaping, your understanding of urban ecosystems. It's exactly what they're looking for." The morning breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of ripening tomatoes and fresh herbs. Elliot finally took the card, his gloved fingers leaving slight smudges of earth on its edges. Danica smiled, knowing she'd made her point. "Take some time to think about it," she said, already turning to leave. "But don't wait too long. It's a chance to make a real difference, Mr. Harrison. On a much bigger scale than this." She gestured to the garden around them, then walked back down the path, the gate clicking shut behind her. The following days took on a strange, distracted quality. Elliot found himself pulling out old blueprints from boxes he'd stored in the attic, spreading them across his kitchen table late at night. His laptop, usually reserved for ordering seeds and checking weather patterns, now displayed architectural websites and urban development forums. The garden began to show signs of his divided attention. The cucumber plants were overwatered, their leaves yellowing at the edges. Tools were left out overnight, collecting morning dew and beginning to rust. Even the compost piler, usually carefully maintained, started to smell wrong from incorrect layering. Root picked up on the shift in energy, becoming more restless than usual. He no longer settled into his favourite sunny spots, but instead followed Elliot constantly, as if afraid his human might disappear when He wasn't looking at night. He'd whine softly at the study door while Elliot pored over old project files. The kids noticed the changes too. Wheeze found himself having to ask twice about which seedlings needed, transplanting Nico's questions about proper. Pruning techniques went half-answered, but it was Maya who watched, most carefully her artist eye catching every detail of Elliot's distraction. One afternoon, as Elliot stood staring at the garden's layout with unseeing eyes, Maya finally spoke up, sir. Set down her sketchbook and approached him directly, her small frame straight with determination. You leaving? She asked, her voice carrying both accusation and fear. The question seemed to snap Elliot out of his thoughts. He looked down at Maya. Then, at the garden around them, the late summer light filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground. Root sat nearby, his ears perked forward, waiting instead of answering. Elliot knelt down beside a patch of weeds that had sprung up near the herb bed. His hands moved automatically, fingers digging into the soil. The earth was dark and rich between his fingers, nothing like the hard-packed dirt they'd started with months ago. As he pulled at the weeds, something caught his eye. The unmistakable movement of earthworms. He carefully scooped one up, holding it in his palm. The worm wriggled against his skin, healthy and active. Maya knelt beside him, watching. Earthworms mean good soil, she said, quietly remembering one of his early lessons. Elliot nodded. Watching the worm's movements, everything they'd built was here in his palm, the months of composting, the careful attention to natural processes, the patience it took to transform. Barren ground into living soil, the worm continued its dance in his hand, unaware of its role as a symbol of their success. Not yet, he murmured gently, lowering his hand to the ground. With careful fingers he tucked the worm back into its dark home, watching as it disappeared into the earth they'd created together. The clouds had been gathering all evening, dark and heavy with promise. Drained by midnight, the air felt thick enough to cut with a knife, and thunder rolled in the distance like a warning drum. Elliot sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by architectural drawings. He couldn't focus on while Root paced anxiously across. The worn floorboards every few minutes, Root would stop at the back door, ears twitching at each distant rumble. His three-legged gait created an uneven rhythm against the wooden floor. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Elliot watched him with growing concern, remembering how storms had affected Root since the day he'd found him. It's okay, boy, Elliot murmured, but his words were swallowed by a sudden crack of thunder that seemed to split Thesky. Root froze, his whole body trembling. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the roof and windows. Lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen in stark white bursts. Root's pacing became more frantic, his nails clicking faster against the floor. His breathing came in short, sharp pants. Elliot stood up, meaning to close the back gate he'd left open after working late in the garden, but before he could move, another thunderclap boomed overhead, closer this time. Explosive Root let out a low, frightened growl and bolted through the kitchen door out into the yard. Root! Elliot called, running after him. The rain was falling in sheets, now heavy, and cold. Through the curtain of water, he caught a glimpse of Root's dark shape, disappearing through the open gate. Root, stop! But the dog was gone, vanishing into the storm-dark streets. Elliot ran after him, his shoes squatching in the mud of the garden path. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, and his clothes were soaked through in seconds. Lightning flashed again briefly, illuminating the empty street. Elliot turned in circles, calling Root's name into the darkness. His voice was nearly lost in the storm's fury. He ran down one street, then another, checking behind dumpsters and under-parked cars. Hours passed in a blur of rain and searching Elliot's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across empty lots and down alleyways. His throat grew raw from calling. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and his soaked clothes clung to his skin. But he kept. Going dawn finally broke grey and, watery, finding Elliot still searching. His movements had become mechanical. Shine, the light call. Root's name, move forward, repeat. His flashlight batteries were dying, the beam growing weaker with each passing minute, exhausted and drenched to the bone. Elliot finally turned toward home. His feet felt like lead, and his heart felt heavier still. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, and the thunder had moved on, but the damage was done. He was barely through his front gate when he heard familiar, Voices approaching the kids were arriving for their usual morning garden work, their chatter falling silent as they took in his appearance. "Mr. Harrison?" Maya stepped forward, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. "What happened?" "Root's gone, Elliot," said his voice from hours of calling. "Ran off during the storm, I couldn't find him." The words seemed to galvanize the kids into action. Maya immediately opened, her sketchbook flipping to a clean page. "We need to make flyers," she said, her pencil already moving across the paper. "I can draw his picture, everyone will notice a three-legged dog." Wes, quiet as always, pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket without a word. He began marking arrows on the sidewalk, creating a systematic grid pattern for searching his face, showed intense concentration as he worked out the most efficient routes. Nico, who usually held himself apart with careful indifference, was already heading back toward the street. "I know most of the neighbours," he said, his usual defensive tone replaced with determination. "I'll start asking around." The day passed in a flurry of activity. Maya's detailed drawings of routes soon covered telephone poles and store windows throughout. The neighbourhood Wes's chalk arrows guided volunteer searchers down every street and alley in a carefully planned pattern. Nico's door-to-door campaign had mobilised dozens of local residents to join the search. Other kids from the neighbourhood joined. Attracted by the energy of the search, they formed teams checking parks and empty lots, calling Root's name, and whistling. Even Mrs. Chen from the corner store put Root's picture in her window and offered free coffee to searchers boot as the day wore on and the sun began to set. There was still no sign of Root. The searching groups grew smaller, and the kids had to head home promising tour turn. First thing in the morning, Elliot found himself alone again, sitting on his porch steps in the growing darkness. In his hands he held Root's favourite rope toy, the first one he'd bought at the feed store, now worn and frayed from months of play. The familiar weight of it in his hands made his chest ache. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow around him, but beyond that circle of light, the darkness seemed absolute. For the first time since he'd found Root buried in that lot, Elliot felt truly lost. The garden behind him, which had become a sanctuary for both of them, now seemed empty and still. The evening breeze rustled through the plants they'd grown together, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. But it wasn't Root sitting there in the darkness. Elliot did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed not out loud. He couldn't have found the words. If he tried, but in his heart, he reached out with everything he had, asking for help, for guidance, for Root's safe return. As he sat there, head bowed over the rope toy, a memory suddenly surfaced. It was from the early days when Root was still healing. There had been another storm not as bad as this one, but bad enough to. Frighten the dog. Root had disappeared then too, and Elliot had found him hours later, huddled behind the old factory, where he'd first discovered him, the condemned lot. Of course, even after all these months, it was still a place Root associated with. Survival somewhere he might return to when his fears overwhelmed him. Elliot stood up, his joints protesting after hours of searching. He grabbed his coat from its hook by the door, not bothering to check if it was dry. The memory had sparked something, like hope in his chest, and he couldn't ignore it without hesitation. He stepped off the porch and headed toward the street, leaving the porch light burning behind him like a beacon. The abandoned factory loomed against the night sky, its broken windows like dark eyes watching Elliot approach. His flashlight beam swept across overgrown paths he hadn't walked since that first morning months ago. The air still carried the metallic scent of recent rain, and his shoes squished in the mud as he made his way toward the fence line route. His voice sounded different here, smaller somehow against the empty building's bulk. The beam of light caught something moving in the shadows. Not Root, just debris stirred by the wind, but Elliot kept walking, drawn by something deeper than logic. As he rounded the corner of the fence, his light fell on a patch of ground that made his breath catch. There among scattered lupines and milkweed he'd planted in the spring was a familiar dark shape. Root lay curled beneath the same gnarled oak tree where Elliot had first uncovered him, his wet fur matted against his body. Root! Elliot whispered, his voice breaking slightly. The dog's head lifted at the sound, eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. There was no fear in those eyes now. No desperate struggle for survival like that first day instead. Root's tail thumped once against the wet ground. In quiet recognition, Elliot knelt in the mud beside him. Not caring about his clothes, his hands shook slightly as he reached out, checking. Root for injuries, the dog was soaked through, but otherwise unharmed. Root shifted, lifting his head to rest it heavily against Elliot's leg, a gesture of complete trust that made Elliot's throat tight with emotion. "You came back here," Elliot murmured, running his hand over Root's wet fur, of all places. The wildflowers around them swayed in the gentle post-storm breeze, their petals still holding drops of rain. These were the same species he'd been cataloguing in his journal the day he'd found Root now, growing strong and wild where he'd planted them. After a few quiet moments, Elliot stood slowly. "Let's go home, boy." Root got to his feet, his three-legged gait more pronounced from exhaustion. Elliot didn't rush him, matching his pace step for step as they made their way back through the silent streets. "You had us worried," Elliot said softly as they walked. "Those kids of ours nearly turned the town upside down, looking for you." Root's ears perked at the mention of the kids, and his pace picked up slightly. Despite his obvious fatigue, the streetlights cast long shadows. As they walked, and Elliot kept up a quiet stream of conversation, he talked about Maya's detailed drawings on the flyers, about Wes's elaborate chalk-mark search grid, about Nico knocking on doors all day. Root listened, as he always did, with that peculiar intensity that made him seem more than just a dog. As they turned onto their street, a figure suddenly darted out from the shadow of a tree. It was Nico who must have been keeping watch. The usually guarded teenager sprinted toward them, all pretense of coolness forgotten. Root. Nico's shout carried down the quiet street. The sound brought more movement. Ma and Wes emerged from Elliot's front porch, where they'd apparently been waiting. Despite the late hour, they ran to join Nico, their faces lit with relief. The reunion was something special to witness. Root, despite his exhaustion, wagged his tails. The kids surrounded him. Their hands were gentle as they petted him, checked him over, pressed their faces into his wet fur. Maya was crying quietly, though she tried to hide it. Wes, who rarely spoke above a whisper, was actually laughing, and Nico had his arms around Root's neck, murmuring something too soft for anyone else to hear. "He was at the factory," Elliot explained, watching the scene with a full heart. "Right where we found him by the flowers?" Maya asked, wiping her eyes. When Elliot nodded, she smiled. "Of course he was. That's his special place now. We made it beautiful for him." They all helped Root up the porch steps and into the house. Maya ran to get towels while Wes filled a bowl with fresh water. Nico found Root's favourite blanket and spread it in front of the heating vent. They worked together with the easy familiarity of family, each knowing their role without having to be told later, after the kids had finally gone home, extracting multiple promises from Elliot to call if anything happened. Elliot sat at his kitchen table. His laptop hummed quietly as he opened his email, finding the consulting offer from the city firm still waiting for a response. The job would be perfect, meaningful work. Good pay, a chance to clear his name completely. The cursor hovered over the reply button. As Elliot read through the offer again, from the living room came the soft sound of Root shifting on his blankets, settling in for sleep. Elliot thought about the garden outside, about the kids who showed up every morning ready to work and learn. He thought about Root finding his way back to the very spot where their story had begun, but returning to a place transformed by care and attention into something beautiful. Without hesitation, Elliot closed the laptop lid. The decisive click seemed to echo in the quiet kitchen. He stood and walked to the back door, stepping out onto the porch. The garden looked different tonight. The kids had been busy while he was searching, for Root. Strands of fairy lights crisscrossed overhead between the trees, and fence posts casting a soft magical glow over the beds. They'd all worked so hard to create the lights reflected off the rain-wet leaves and flowers, making everything shimmer. Root had followed him out, moving slowly but steadily on his 3 legs. He lowered himself onto a patch of grass near the porch steps, sighing contentedly as he settled. The fairy lights twinkled above him like earthbound stars, and for a moment Elliot saw their garden as if through new eyes, not just plants and soil, but a place of healing, of second chances, of coming home. "We're staying," Elliot whispered, the words feeling right in his mouth. Root's tail thumped once against the grass in quiet agreement, and above them, the fairy lights continued to shine, marking their place in the world. The morning dawned clear and bright, washing away all traces of the previous night's drama. Sunlight streamed through the garden, catching dewdrops on leaves and creating tiny rainbows. Birds called from the newly installed feeders. their songs cheerful and constant. Elliot stepped onto his front, porch coffee mug in hand, and found Root already at his usual post by the garden gate. The dog lay peacefully in a patch of sunshine, his eyes half closed but alert. Tracking the movement of sparrows overhead, his fur had dried completely, showing no sign of his nighttime adventure. What surprised Elliot most was that the kids had already arrived and gotten to work without waiting for direction. The sight made him pause, mid-sip taking in the scene before him. Wes knelt by the corner planter his stools, spread out methodically as he reinforced the wooden sides that had started to bow from the weight of soil. His movements were precise and careful, measuring twice before each cut, of wood Maya had set up her own workspace near the tool shed where she carefully hung laminated versions of her garden sketches. She'd clearly thought ahead about protecting them from the weather, and the morning light made the drawings glow like stained glass. Her artistic touch had transformed simple planting diagrams into something beautiful. Flowering vines, twined around the margins, and careful notes about plant species were written in her flowing script. The biggest surprise came from Nico. The once angry teenager stood near the herb section, surrounded by two younger kids from the neighbourhood, probably no more than 8 or 9 years old. He demonstrated how to dig proper holes for basil seedlings, his voice patient. As he explained about depth and spacing, the little ones watched with complete attention, copying his movements exactly. "See, you want it just deep enough," Nico was saying, measuring with his fingers. "Too deep and it'll rot, too shallow and it'll dry out like this." "Yeah, that's perfect, kid." Elliot watched them all. Work something warm, expanding. In his chest he didn't interrupt, just observed how naturally they moved through the space they'd all created together. Root lifted his head and thumped his tail in greeting, which finally drew everyone's attention to Elliot's presence. "Oh good, you're up," Maya called out, wiping her hands on her jeans as she hurried over. "We have something to show you." Her excitement was contagious, and the others quickly gathered around from behind the tool shed. Maya produced something wrapped in an old cloth. With ceremonial care, she unveiled a wooden sign, clearly hand-carved and sealed against the weather. The letters were deep and sure: "Reading Root Garden, where people and things grow back stronger." Elliot stared at the sign, his coffee forgotten. In his hand, the words caught something essential about what had happened here over the past months. Not just the physical transformation of the space, but the deeper changes in all of them. "We thought, well, we wanted to make it official," Ma explained, suddenly nervous in the face of his silence. "Can we name it that?" for Root at the sound of his name. Root lifted his head higher, looking from the kids to Elliot with those knowing eyes of his. Elliot had to clear his throat before he could speak, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overflow. "Yes," he managed, nodding. "It's perfect together." They hung the sign on the garden gate, taking time to make sure it was level. The morning sun caught the carved letters, highlighting them in gold. Something about seeing the name made it all feel more real. More permanent. The week that followed felt like watching time-lapse photography of a flower blooming. Elliot filed the paperwork to establish the garden as a non-profit organisation, spending hours at his kitchen table with Root lying across his feet. The town council not only approved the application, but seemed genuinely excited about the community green space project. Maya's sketches became the centrepiece of their brochure, her artistic vision helping others see the potential they'd all recognised. She blushed when people praised her work, but stood a little taller each time. Wes threw himself into building a new bench, working with wood donated by the local lumberyard. His design incorporated clever features: a slight angle for comfort hidden, compartments for tools, 7 a small water dish holder for Root. He didn't say much when it was finished, but his proud smile said everything necessary. The most striking change was in Nico. The bruises that had once marked his arms had faded completely, and he carried himself differently now, straighter. More confident one afternoon, he approached Elliot with a piece of paper clutched in his hand. "The bike shop downtown," he said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide his excitement. "They want to hire me as an apprentice mechanic, but they need an adult to co-sign since I'm still 17. He held out the paper. Not quite meeting Elliot's eyes, Elliot took the job. Offa read it carefully, then reached for a pen without hesitation. "Where do we sign?" The simple act seemed to release something in Nico. His shoulders relaxed, and he finally looked up. "Thanks," he said softly, "for everything." That evening, Elliot cooked dinner for all of them, a big pot of pasta with fresh herbs from their garden garlic bread that filled the kitchen with warmth, and homemade lemonade sweetened with mint they carried, everything. Outside, setting up on the new bench and some chairs they'd arranged, inner circle lanterns cast a gentle glow over their meal, complementing the fairy lights that still twinkled overhead. Root settled nearby, his head resting on his paws as he watched, then with contentment. The evening air was perfect, not too warm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and herbs. Looking around at them all, Mia explaining her latest design ideas, Wes quietly building a tower of garlic bread, Nico teaching the younger kids. A card trick between bites. Elliot felt something settle in his chest. This was what healing looked like. This was what growth meant. "You've grown this better than I ever could," he said suddenly. Surprising himself with the words, the kids laughed, but there was understanding in their eyes. They knew he wasn't just talking about the plants. Root lifted his head and gave a soft woof, as if adding his agreement to the statement. 6 months passed like a season changing. Gradual yet transformative, the root garden had grown beyond its original boundaries, spreading across 3 connected lots that hummed with life and purpose. Neat gravel paths wound between raised beds and around carefully planned sitting areas. The compost bins, Nico's pride and joy, stood in orderly rows near the back, their rich soil feeding new growth throughout the space. A small shed transformed into a tool library offered everything from tells to wheelbarrows for community use. Elliot stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, watching a group of 3rd graders follow their teacher along the butterfly garden path. Dirt lined his fingernails and sweat dampened his shirt collar, evidence of the morning's work, but his posture was different now, more open, his eyes clear and engaged as he made notes about which plants needed attention every Tuesday, and Thursday local schools brought classes to learn about sustainable gardening, native plants, and the importance of community spaces. Today's group clustered around Maya, who knelt beside a patch of wildflowers, explaining how different plants attracted different pollinators. Her voice carried clearly, confident now in sharing her knowledge. Volunteers moved purposefully through the garden, watering, weeding, harvesting. Some were regulars, others new faces drawn by the garden's growing reputation. Root wandered between them, his 3-legged gait steady, and sure, occasionally pausing to accept gentle pats from those he trusted most. When Elliot's phone buzzed in his pocket, he recognised the number from the city architecture firm this time, instead of letting it go to voicemail. He answered. The conversation was brief, but "Warm thank you for thinking of me," he said, watching a young girl carefully plant the first seedling. "But I found something better here, something that matters more." The representative understood. They'd seen the articles. The community impact reports, what had started as a personal project, had grown into something the whole town talked about. A place of transformation, not just for plants, but for people later. That afternoon, Danica Lear arrived with her camera. She'd been following the garden's progress since her original article cleared Elliot's name, documenting its growth through her lens. Today she wanted a photo for a feature on successful community initiatives. Just be natural. She called out, adjusting her camera settings. "Pretend I'm not here." Elliot stood beneath the wooden sign that still proclaimed Root Garden, where people and things grow back stronger. Root sat beside him, alert and dignified around them. Kids worked at planting a row of sunflower seeds, their faces bright with concentration. The scene captured everything. The garden had become a place of learning, growth and second chances. The calm of the photo session broke into laughter as Wes and Nico began their weekly compost race. They pushed loaded wheelbarrows along the paths, careful not to spill, despite their speed, heading for the new beds being prepared for fall planting. Root barked excitedly, limping along beside them as if officiating their competition near the tool library. Maya worked steadily on her latest project, a sprawling mural that transformed the shed's plain wall into a vibrant garden scene at its centre. She'd painted Root lying in a bed of flowers, his missing leg not hidden, but celebrated his expression, peaceful and proud. The real Root occasionally paused in his rounds to study his painted counterpart, tail wagging in apparent approval as afternoon mellowed toward evening. Elliot made his final walk of the day along the garden's perimeter, Where there had once been weeds and broken glass, now flowers bloomed. In carefully planned succession, ensuring colour through every season. Butterflies danced between blossoms and bird feeders hung full and well visited. He paused near the original bench. The first piece of furniture they'd restored together. Root lay, there in a patch of sunlight, his eyes half closed. In contentment, Elliot sat beside him, feeling the warm wood beneath his hands. Listening to distant laughter as the last few kids finished their projects for the day, opening his field journal, Elliot realised how long it had been since he'd used it purely for cataloguing plants. No, its pages held sketches of people Maya teaching younger students about colour theory, Wes explaining his latest irrigation innovation, Nico proudly showing off his first paycheck. From the bike shop, there were quick studies of route in various poses and groups of volunteers sharing lunch on the lawn, looking at these drawings at the life captured in pencil strokes. Elliot understood something fundamental. He wrote it down, the words flowing naturally. It wasn't the garden I needed. To fix it was me, and I never had to do it alone. If you enjoyed the story of Elliot and Root, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.